I'm happy to now invite our second speaker for this afternoon. Once again, dwelling on the same global questions, but someone who comes at it from a perspective of having explored some particular genres of literature that she herself has grown up with and has been greatly inspired by. Karun Sagari is a Bharatanatyam artist currently under the mentorship of Srimati Malavika Sarukai. She previously trained for a decade under Sri Shrijit Krishna after completing her diploma at Kalakshetra Foundation. She holds a master's degree in South Asian Studies from the University of Heidelberg in Germany and a master's degree in Tamil from Annamalai University. The inheritor of a rich oral matrilineal legacy in poetry and music, Karuna received rigorous, in-depth instruction in bhakti spiritualism, poetics, and performance from her grandmother, the late Srimati Swarna Somasundaram, an esteemed scholar of classical and medieval Tamil literature. Her choreography into ancient and medieval Tamil works have shown imagination and depth, and I'm very happy that she will be today talking to us about the process behind some of those works. I welcome you, Karuna.
Namaskaram. Thank you so much for this invitation, Apurva and the Navadhisa team. And my pranams to all the seniors in front of me and the young dancers who are here to explore the art as in the same spirit. Before I go on to the presentation today, I'd like to say that I'm representative of two streams of knowledge. One, my party, Srimati Swarna Somasundaram, a scholar who has been living the philosophy which he practiced and also taught for 5 decades until the day she passed away, which was last year. And I also represent the numerous scholars who are usually monolingual, so they don't get the limelight at all. These are scholars in Coimbatore with whom I had the privilege of learning. And I would fail in my duty if I don't recognize my professors from Heidelberg University who brought in academic rigor into pursuit of classical texts. In fact, my foray into Sangam poetry is very much after my stint at Heidelberg because it brought in so much rigor of how to separate, how to read it, how to reread it, how to contextualize it, and so on. So today I start. So when we say exploration of alternate literature, I think it is so amazing that Padoka is here, who has been doing this for decades of not only bringing in alternate literature, but making it own the entire performance space. So I'm very blessed to present this in front of you. And so initially, let me just give my definition of what I mean as alternate literature, just for clarity. So it's non-commissioned literature, which means we are not having anyone write it for us. And it need not be written for the stage. Like most Sangam poems did not even have the idea of an audience when it was said, because who spoke and who listened were there in the poem itself. It was not done for a person from outside. So it was not necessarily written for the stage. It may or may not be set into music. Like for the Tevarams which I've used, there have been a lot of Tevarams which I've just retained the Panmurai so that we can take it as it reflects the original flavor. And there are poems like Ahna Noru where it was not meant to be sung, but then it was set to music. And the last most important point is that it may not necessarily fit into any of the existing Margam format, like Pallavi, Anupallavi, Charanam, you might not have. And I'll get into more details. So today I'm going to present the talk in 3 parts. The first is the fidelity to the syntax of the literature. So when you say fidelity, it's a lot of responsibility, because you're not only standing for a performance, but you're actually representative of a culture, a language, a literature. So, and the second part is, how do you familiarize yourself with the landscape of the literature? It is not just taking one song and choreographing for it, and like how Mahati very beautifully explained of the process and the intertextuality which you need to think about when you bring such literature into dancing. And the third part is not for the stalwarts here, but for people of my age and people who would like to go a little outside of the Margam format to bring in other kinds of literature. So where do you start? Like, that's a big question. Like, where do you start? It's so vast, and we know it. It's ancient, it's vast, it's unending. Then where do you start? So this is going to be basically my presentation. So we start with the fidelity to the syntax of the literature. Here, the format of the Margam versus an emerging format. So I think when we take up work which is fresh and untouched, then the easiest, or I think the first impulse is to take it into a format which we already know, put it into that and do it. But then what happens to how faithful are we to the literature itself? So when we look at the challenges in working out a format, it often is uncomfortable because it shakes you. It makes you rethink. So I'd just like to say how we have the comfort of repetition in a varnam or a kirtanam or a padam, where the pallavi comes and ties in again and again and again to whether it's the anupallavi or the charanam, and then you can get back to the pallavi. It's not the same in all of the literature. And I thought I'll give you an example of Tiruvangamale. Tiruvangamale is Appar's very beautiful poem, which speaks about each of the part of his body and say, you worship the Lord. So, Talaye ni vanangai, it starts. And in this, let me just give you two verses. One is Kangal Kanmingalo, Kadal Nanjunda Kandantanai, Entol Visi Nindadum Pirantane, Kangal Kanmingalo. So, Kangal Kanmingalo, O eyes, watch him. Who is he? Kadal Nanjunda Kandantanai. He is the one who took in the poison for the rest of the living beings to survive. So, O eyes, look at the one who has drunk the poison. This is the first line. So, can you turn it around? Yes. Kangal Kanmingalo, Kadal Nanjunda Kandantanai, Kangal Kanmingalo works. Now, let us just take Vaye Varthu Kandai. O mouth, sing his praise. Vaye Varthu Kandai. Madayanai Uri Porthu. Can we turn it around? Madayanai Uri Porthu means after shredding and wearing the hide of the elephant. Imagine if you turn it around. O mouth, sing his praise after tearing and wearing the hide of the elephant, sing his praise. So that won't work because the sentence isn't complete there. Vaye Varthu Kandai, Madayanai Uri Porthu, Peivar Kattagattadum Pirantanai Vaye Varthu Kandai. So that line doesn't end there. So it cannot be turned around. So that is one way, like we can say, I think it demonstrates how dangerous it can get. And this is again a very, very interesting part is the order. Like when we have a comfort of an order because it's preordained. So when you take it and work it through, there is a natural a flow for the dance performance because it was made for dance. But when you do take literature which is slightly outside of the dancing realm, you have to find that order. it doesn't present itself like right in the face. So I have another example which is like super challenging. It has been for me, and it's from the Ahananuru. The Agnanuru is one of the Agam poetry, and they are long poems. And this one, I've just given the Tamil line, Mullai Vainune Thondra, Illamudu Paingal, Kondrai Mel Piniyavida, Irumbu Thiritannama. It just runs. I've just taken the first 7 lines. And here is the order in which it's translated. So, mullai flowers with pointed tips have appeared. The tetra tree buds and the buds of kondrai with green stems have opened their tight petals and blossomed. A huge stag with antlers like twisted iron romps around and plays in the gravel pits. The sorrow of the people in the wide earth has gone away, and clouds with lightning and thunder roar and pour down drops of rain. The forest has grown beautiful. This is the first 8 lines. So if you see this, if I start a performance just right there, it doesn't contextualize anything, because I'm just starting with jasmines blossoming and kondrais falling down and deers running around. But the moment you put it this way, I'm sorry, it's not big enough, but anyway, I'll read it. My first line was, the forest has grown beautiful. Kar seidandre kavin perukanam. Karuvivanam kadalurai sidari. The entire sky is rumbling and the waters have poured. But now is the small thing which we need to think about. They are talking about lightning and thunder. Do you think when it is full of lightning and thunder and pouring rain, that jasmines will blossom? Where actually, this is what happened, and the forest has become beautiful after that. And you are talking about this mullai, this kondrai, this iralai man, all of them who come in reaction to all that the rain has done to the forest. So when we had to do it, this was the order. So I started with line 8, then I come to line 7, which says how the rains poured, and go back to line 8 and say that the rains have receded, and then come to the mullai flowers, which sprout. So the forest has grown beautiful, and the kondrai flowers, after the rains, the breeze which hits the flowers makes it just shrivel and fall down. So that is also not during the rain, after the rains. And how the deers run, because the dried up stream has gained water, so it goes to the first fresh puduvellam. It comes to the new waters. So this is not said in the poem as such, but it has to be perceived. And this is where I think syntax plays a huge role. What do you put where, and how do you learn it? How do you read it? And this we call, in the olden methods, porulkol. Where do you start and how do you make sense out of it? But it was not in my porulkol class I learned it, but in this classroom of Heidelberg, where I sat with one Italian student, one Russian student, and one German professor who had his thesis on Kapilar, who helped me do this. So you never know where you find your roots. It might be 7,000 kilometers away. So with this, let us come to the second point I wanted to say, of how do you get a feel for the poem. I think who wrote it and at what point of history were they in makes a huge, huge impact on our perception of a poem. Because I think this is what in the academia they call it positionality, of who you are informs the way you think and the way you make your academic conclusions. So that also recognizes human bias, which I think is the biggest advantage, not a disadvantage, of being human, because we have our opinions, we have our biases, we have our focus, and that makes us human. So positionality is what I'm getting at this point. So here is a very interesting quote from Mukunda Rao's book on Akka Mahadevi. Though this is not a Veerashaiva exploration at all, but I felt this is very important. I'll read it for you. The term Veerashaiva appears nowhere in the Vachanas of Basavanna or Allama Prabhu or in any of the Vachanas of their contemporaries. To club Allama Prabhu, Akka Mahadevi, along with Basavanna, under such an umbrella term would do gross injustice to the unique personality of each of them, just as it would be incorrect and unfair to speak of Andal, the Alvars, Basavanna, Allama, Meera, Akka Mahadevi, Lalleshwari, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Kabir in a similar vein as mere players who performed on the stage of bhakti to a common script. Which means we cannot blanket things. We cannot take the individuality out in our impulse to see it as one monolithic structure. I think that is where this quote has really helped me do it. So now let us go into how do you be specific. Now we know we shouldn't be we shouldn't be generalizing. So where do you get these pointers to be specific? So now I go into the landscape of the poem, not in the literal sense of landscape as in Tinai, but just let us take objects and their symbolism. We, as dancers, rely heavily on iconography. We rely so heavily that it is possible to have only iconography and finish off choreography. It's that we are that dependent. But these iconographic details cannot be generalized. For instance, if you take the iconography of Nataraja, we have the Damaru, the Agni, the Man, the Maru, and all of it. But have you noticed the ghanta on his? You'll see it just above his calf on the right leg, which is on the ground. It has a beautiful symbolism. It seems he has taken it upon himself as a sankalpam that he will put all the beings to bliss. And that is why he wears it, like a kangana, like he will do it. So when you think of it in the Tamil context, it's so at home that we think like that. It's just there. But when you see it from another context, this is such a new perspective which can give that the Lord has taken it upon himself as a responsibility to lift everyone up. So that Ghanta Mani is a very, very local usage of this thought. And when we look at symbolism, again, these are all Pati's bedtime things which he says. Symbolism of feet bearing marks, the feet bearing marks of the Devas' crowns. It's usually there in a lot of Tiruvachakam. Especially, they'll say how their makutas have left marks on his feet when they bowed. And she said, you know why? They didn't bother to take their crowns out. That's why they are still far. So, when you have this idea that you need to leave the me and the mine in order to go to the feet, which is the meaning of Tiruvadi as such. In Shaiva Siddhanta, when you speak about the feet, it's where you leave me and the mine, you reach the Tiruvadi. And that is why the Devas are still in heavens, trying to get there, but they've not left their crowns. So how beautiful is this as a motif, as something to be developed in dance. And ornaments and everyday actions is another very, very important thing. If you take up Sangam poem, and if we can use the current idea of tying flowers, of waiting at the door, of decorating oneself, it might not always sit very well. Because in the Sangam poem, it matters whether the girl is from Neidal or Marudam. Because if the girl is from Neidal, she'll rather wear conch bangles, not gold. And if it is Sangam, even the older this thing, they only wore skirts made of leaves, big leaves, and with the chandanam on their bosom, and with just small leaves sprinkled upon themselves. So if we are going to show silk, we are done. We are gone. So it's very important where this comes from. So, and the other thing also I felt, now that we know that these are all there, now the big question. So what? So what if we need to do this at all? Because it is a poem, it's set to music, and now we are dancing it. Why? Why do we need to know all these things? The question can be answered very simply. In the same poem which I had shown you before from the Ahananoru, this is the Mullai, that's the Kondre. I'm sorry, I've written it wrong. It's not Mullai, it's Kandal. Kandal is always likened to be the palm of the woman. So, and it looks like this. So, can we just show Kandal like this? No, we can't. And Mullai are like this, like buds coming there. And Kondre has to be like this. So can we just generalize flowers at that? Actually, we can't, because the poem demands more than this. Now I have to speak about that deer which I spoke, which darts. This is a stunner, you should see this. This is Iralai. Meet Mr. Iralai. He's this stag. When I read about the poem, I wanted to go back to this and just read what a huge stag with antlers like twisted iron. Like twisted iron. Now you get there. Twisted iron. And then I went in search of all the deers with these antlers, and found that most of them were in the Himalayas, and this one is in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and a few other places, which means this is the one, and it fits the description perfectly. And even more interesting is that this deer with such big this thing, it grazes only in places like that. It doesn't get into the woods, so that it doesn't get caught. So when we are having all these details in mind, then definitely our deer will be more alive than just a pulliman. So just to show one little bit of how this took shape was, so first of all, it couldn't be the little sweet Pulliman, but it had to be this male, virile, this majestic character. And this man does not allow another competitor in the team. So there's only one stag for an entire herd. And even more interesting is this Kandal, because in this particular poem, the man thinks of the girl with her fragrance, or saying she smells like Kandal. And it's even interesting to know that the Kandal loses its fragrance in 3 to 4 months from the time it grows, which is the same time it takes for the man to return back when it's Karkalam. So these things were connected. It's just that how sensitive are we to go back to those connections, saying that the wait is done, you have to come back now. And the Kandal might lose its fragrance if you don't. So this way, I think the poem just gets up and stands. And I think then we won't stop with just reading the line, but feeling the touch, the fragrances, the sounds of that age, the people, the food, their occupation, and everything else. So this is when I think the objects need so much attention, because as dancers, we are completely relying on objects. Definitely. Besides the human emotions, we need our martel, our kammal, our this thing, our mirror. We are so dependent. So the more sensitive we are, the objects speak to us more. And so now, this is my favorite part. Where do we begin? When you know, like, it is true that I've had the blessing of growing up with Patti, and she just kept on telling things. But I'm an absolute novice when I come, if I want to explore something in Kabir, for instance. So where do you start? Like, even in my house, only medieval literature was given this much importance. Classical was my own journey after that. So I think there can never be a time when anybody can feel lucky enough to be born into a family which has everything. I don't think that's possible because we have too much in India and we own it all. So it's so where do we start is a very important place. So first of all, 15 years ago, this topic would have been so much more difficult to handle, but today we have the internet, and I should recount this almost shocking anecdote. We started Silapadigaram in Heidelberg University in my last semester, and as I said, the classmates were Russian and Italian, and so this professor brought this small comic on Silapadigaram. That was our first reading. I was like, give me a break. I thought we were doing serious literary stuff, and what is this? Like, it was a picture comic of Silapadigaram. And we started there. I was like, how can we read literature like this? But then I was amazed to see the first day we did that. Second day we did short essays for school children. That was the second day. And the third class, we moved into different takes on on Chilapadigaram, like Karunanidhi's Chilapadigaram and Uvesa, and, a very different myriad points of contact. And then we were actually reading the text after the fifth, sixth class. We were actually reading the text line by line with these Russians and Italians reading chaste Tamil. So when did this happen? Like, how did we move from that very gross approach to Silapadigaram to this very fine approach? So I think the same is possible on the internet now. But the problem is when we stop at the comic level. That's the problem. It's not wrong to start there, but it's a huge problem to stop there. And so I think instead of Google search is super helpful, but besides Google search, if you can get into Google Scholar, see, I typed Tevaram in both, in Google Scholar, Google, and Google Books. Google Scholar gives you citations of published work, which means they are all authentic. So then what happens, with those citations, you can go in search of your bibliography to where to start. And Google Books directly points you to books. If you are Tamil, or like if you can read Kannada and you are dealing with Kannada literature, you can get into this is called Sanskrit, where you can type in English, and Google Input Tools is best for that, and you get the actual language. So Tevaram, right, in this was, I typed it in English, and if you do the same in Tamil, it will give you Tamil books and Tamil writings and all of that. Sanskrit is also another very interesting tool, because if you have a Tamil word typed into Sanskrit, it will give you the right diacritics, which means you don't have to go searching for te, va, you need to make it long, and it's difficult to type in like that. So if you use this, it converts it. So all these were super, super helpful, because if you need to search the lexicon, Chicago has this huge Tamil lexicon, it's all digital. So if you want to come here, if you type in English, you'll only get half the results. So if you go into Sanskrit or Google Input Tools, get it into that, and then bring it here, then your chances of coming closer to the meaning is higher. So when you, this I think is the first step, where you do self-research before you even talk to one single person outside. So now when we go to the scholars, we'll have a little more idea of the right questions to ask, where to start. And I think the second part is most important, making friends with the language and people who know the language. People who know the language, they all need not be scholars, but even if they are able to read and write that particular language, you can still hold them if you've landed yourself with the right book. So then you go ahead and take it from there. And the third is the most important. All these books, especially the old Sangam books or any of the Kapyangal, which were lost, and Uvesa is the one who revived them, has written this brilliant foreword, which sort of gives you the entire essence of the entire work. So when that is read, it sort of situates you in that particular literature, because it will tell you how many cantos are there, how many songs does what does the first part do, what does the second part do, what is the idea of the literature itself, what is the thing behind it. Now when we do this reading, it situates you, it makes you feel at home. And I think this is what we need to do with any literature, so that when we do go to scholars to ask, we don't ask stupid questions. And the moment we have this in place, that we've done our self-research, we've spoken to the right people, and then you go on a field visit, it makes absolute sense, because then you know what to look at, where to look at, what to ask for, where you can actually take things in directly to dancing, and what you can have it in the back of your mind. So with this, I'd like to come to a conclusion that I think it's a labor of love in order to take literature which is alternate, and this labor of love is absolutely worth it, because it gives you this feeling of like knowing someone very intimately, although they were very far, and then you get to know a little more, and then it's so beautiful. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you, Apurva, for having me.
Thank you so much, Karuna. We can now take questions for Karun Sagari.
So I'm just wondering, in your discussions at Heidelberg and other places, if you had come across any instances where you have considered these scenarios, considered the meaning and the purport, and then deliberately decided to ignore it when you perform, because you wanted to present a counterintuitive, sort of a presentation, or maybe for social, political, other reasons, so, or religious reasons, for instance. So, has there been any instances, and do we have the license to go ahead and do that? Can you give us some examples? Thank you.
When we are studying something, so does it mean that we are completely confined? That's a very, very beautiful question. And I think we are not confined. As long as we take it as an interpretation, then it certainly helps to use that poem as a jumping board, and you dive into something else. 100% we do have the license as artists to interpret. And I think there is also another possibility. One thing is, when we do read the commentaries which were given by the commentators on, let's say, Sangam, or mainly Sangam, they were separated from the works by around 1,000 years. So already it has the color of the commentator, because what Tolkappiyar said itself has been tweaked a little when it came to the commentators themselves. So in that way, we are 2,000 years later to them. So if you want a commentary, definitely you have the license to, one, but it's a different thing to take it up, know it, and then deliberately look at it in another way it makes sense than to take it up because you don't know the original. I think that's what I would say is honest. When you know what is written and then you still want to differ from it. Yeah. I hope that answers.
Okay, if we have no further questions, please join me in once again thanking karun Sagari for a lovely session. Thank you so much, Karuna. Thank you.